Pathways to opportunity at Boston's three exam schools have been disputed for decades. In recent years, leaders in Boston have been looking for new ways to balance fairness and merit, but that's also complicated this year by the pandemic. As a result, and after a marathon hearing, the Boston School Committee decided to waive the entrance exam for the schools for 1 year and use other criteria for admission. That also reflects recommendations by the Exam School Admissions Working Group. Joining us are two of its members, former Boston Latin headmaster in Boston, School Superintendent Michael Contompasis, and the president of the Boston NAACP, Tanisha Sullivan. I'd like to thank you both very much for being with us.
Thank you.
I'll start with Tanisha Sullivan because before the pandemic, there were two camps about these exam schools. There were people who felt there was something that needed to be fixed, and other people who felt these schools are great schools as they are. Please do not meddle with them. So what was it that needed to be fixed here?
Well, I think it's important to note, again, it's 2020. And so certainly the public health pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis and the data really, presented us with a question that needed to be answered. And that is, how are we going to structure our exam school admissions process for the 21-22 school year? And again, that is, the moment that presented us with this question is the COVID-19 pandemic. Once we came to, consensus that from a logistical standpoint, from a public health standpoint, administering a test was not something that would be wise or prudent during this time, then the question was, okay, so now what do we do? And as you mentioned, this is an issue that has been heavily debated for quite some time. It's an issue that that the NAACP Boston branch has studied deeply, and we've commented on, opined on it quite a bit. And so when we got to the what do we do, I think among the working group members, there was an interest and a desire to see if we could, design a process or help design a process that would bring about even greater fairness, equity, and access to all students across the city of Boston.
Michael Contompasis, you were headmaster at Boston Latin School when the admissions process was changed by a federal court order. You had to do things differently. You had to balance inclusion and excellence. How did you make that work?
Well, we had lots of support for ensuring that what the court had asked us to do, we could do at a level that didn't in any way, shape, or form interfere with what one would suggest was the academic rigor that exists within all three exam schools. And so we recognized early on that there might be a need for additional supports to be put in place. And so we had at BLS help from some of our partners. For example, we initiated a program which currently still is in existence at UMass Boston called the TAG program, Talented and Gifted. And this was a program that we instituted at BLS as well as eventually the other two exam schools, in which support was provided in the form of tutoring, counseling, just trying to deal with the myriad of concerns that young people of all ages now bring to school. But in that particular period was centered around ensuring that those kids got the support and the surround care that they needed to do the academic work that was expected of them. We also had a similar partnership with the African American Studies program at Boston University. And what those two programs did was to provide the counseling and the tutoring that was essential if those students who needed it were able to handle what may have been a difficult transition. And so for the period of time that we were under the direction of the federal court, those programs did a great deal, as well as, I might add, during the same period of time at the school, the culture was changing as well. Chris, you may remember your days at BLS. We won't get into those, and we won't get into those days when I was there. But I think you would, if you looked at the changes that occurred over time, much of them driven by the need to ensure that every student that entered was able to finish. That became, in reality, a shift from the sort of sink or swim kind of activity that was inherently part of the tradition of the school.
Tanisha Sullivan, we heard about what some people might look down at as the remediation part, and even almost as a negative, but what about the positive about that culture shift and having a more inclusive school?
Yeah, I think, all learning environments should provide the supports needed for a student to be successful. And, so the question is, what does success look like? It's certainly having an environment where learning is centered, and that students have the opportunity, have the opportunity again and supports to fully access all that the school has to offer through its curriculum, and also through co-curricular activities. That's important. I think, it speaks to a belief system, that all of our young people, regardless of where they start, that they can all finish strong. And I think it also is an acknowledgement that some students, may enter a space, regardless of what school it is, right, may enter a space having had significant preparation and supports on the front end, to prepare them to finish strong, and others may not. Others may, maybe showing up, as a result of their sheer resilience and people like say, and grit, but do require some additional supports to make sure that they make it through because they haven't had the supports on the front end. This isn't about providing, necessarily some students with what others have not had, but it is about really reframing how we think about leveling the playing field and making sure that, again, all students have what they need to, again, finish, not just finish, but to finish strong.
Michael Contompasis, even back when you had the court order, there was still the exam every year. For 1 year, there will be no exam. You're going to be more at the mercy of discrepancies in grading at different schools, whether they're in the Boston public school system or outside it. So how are you going to make those things come out right?
Well, recognizing that, again, the working group came to consensus that for all of the reasons that Tanisha mentioned earlier, giving an exam really presented a number of difficult problems. And so we came to consensus on the idea of establishing an entry level that is somewhat similar to what you would expect to see if indeed the grade point average was the sole mechanism by which admissions would take place. And so we agreed upon any student who resides in the city of Boston who has a B average or better that demonstrates grade level work is eligible to apply if they so choose. Doesn't make any difference what school they're attending as long as they're a resident and they have a B or better average. Now, the committee also struggled with what you touched upon, Chris, and that is the difficulty in maintaining the integrity of the grade point average across different kinds of schools, if you will, for lack of a better term. But we also indicated as a tool for getting into the application pool that we took a look at the fourth grade MCAS results and indicated that any student who also wanted to consider it as an option, who met or exceeded expectations on the fourth grade MCAS, could be considered for admission. The MCAS would not be used to determine the level of invitations, but meeting or exceeding expectations on the MCAS exam indicates that a student is grade level proficient and meets the state standards. And so we've done that, and hopefully it will, for this 1 year, which is an interim process, reflect a sound decision on our part. There is disagreement around the use of a test or an assessment. We're going to come back, obviously, when and if the school committee establishes its task force to continue this work, because all of the recommendations that we've made this year are interim. And I think where those of us who support an assessment are concerned is the possible difficulty with using straight GPA, but also looking at an assessment that determines the readiness of the applicant pool. And so that's what will be, I think, one of the ongoing topics, and one that will be, I hope, hammered out in some measure.
Finally, we just have a little time, Tanisha, but is there any kind of advice you would give to families right now if they have some aspirations, if their children have aspirations to go to these schools and they're sort of on the fence about what to do? What would you tell them?
Well, I think it's important, not just for parents of students who are interested in the exam schools or the selective schools, but also for any parent. I mean, look, we are still in the middle of a public health pandemic, a crisis that has absolutely impacted how learning happens in the city of Boston. And so I think all students are going to need additional supports going into the next academic year. And so for parents and families and caregivers looking for opportunities both through the Boston Public Schools and other opportunities around the city of Boston for that additional learning support for youngsters is critically important. Again, that's regardless of what school. We cannot put our heads in the sand and think that, through this, the last 7, 8, 10 months of this crisis, that students have all gotten what they need. They haven't. So we're all going to have to, do what we can to make sure that all of our students in the city of Boston have access to additional supports going into 21.
I'd like to thank you both very much for taking the time to join us. From the Exam School Admissions Workshop, Michael Contompasis and Tanisha Sullivan. We'll have more news in just a moment.
Thank you.